That winter descended upon the town of Greystone like a quiet sentence. Snow fell relentlessly, covering rooftops, swallowing roads, and blurring the line between humanity and silence. But the sharpest cold didn't come from the wind. It came from the eyes of those who lived there, eyes that judged without speaking, without reason. In a small general store at the heart of town, Isabel Merlot worked quietly, her hands moving swiftly along the shelves, accustomed to the scent of flour, damp wood, and aged liquor. She was the only daughter of Elias Merlot, a stern, widowed man. The townsfolk often looked at Isabel with a mix of pity and suspicion, simply because she worked in a space others deemed unsuitable for a proper lady. One gray afternoon, as the town shuttered its doors early in anticipation of a storm, Isabel heard a mocking laugh behind her. A man's voice sliced through the cold. "Miss Merlot? Not exactly the kind you'd take home to meet your mother." Laughter followed, low and cutting, like shards of ice. She set the sack of flour down, wrapped her scarf, and walked out without a word. The storm had just begun. Snow whipped at her face. The wind tugged at her coat like greedy fingers, but Isabel didn't stop. She only wanted to run from the whispers, the stares, and the ache inside her. She wandered into the forest, tears blurring her sight, feet sinking into deep snow. One misstep, the ground beneath her cracked open. A dry, snapping sound, then silence. She fell. When she came to, the cold had settled into her bones. Her vision blurred. She cried out, once, twice, then quiet. On the other side of the woods, Nathan Hale heard it. Once a renowned interior designer, Nathan had abandoned the world after losing his wife in a fire. Now, he lived alone in a stone cabin nestled deep in the trees, far from the judgment of society and far from grief that never truly left. But that cry, faint, desperate, cut through the wind like a thread of purpose. Grabbing a storm lantern, wrapping himself in thick wool, Nathan stepped out into the blizzard. Nathan trudged through the thick snow, the flicker of his lantern like a sick star trembling in the storm. He found Isabel in a hollow of white, half-buried, lips pale, breath so faint it barely whispered life. Without a word, he lifted her, pressing her close to his chest, shielding her from the wind with his body. His cabin wasn't far, a modest stone and wood shelter with a fire still crackling in the hearth. He laid her by the flames, wrapped her in blankets, boiled water, and gently dripped warm herbal tea onto her lips. He did not sleep. All night he stayed beside her, holding her hand like it was a fragile thread anchoring her to life. When Isabel opened her eyes, the first thing she felt wasn't cold, it was warmth. Soft, dry, persistent warmth brushing her skin like a tender morning touch. The room was quiet, absent of voices, but not of presence. Nathan sat near the fire, his back turned, as if granting her the space to breathe without expectation. "You're safe now," he said, his voice low, hoarse, and unfamiliar. "This is my cabin." Isabel nodded faintly. Words weren't needed. The silence between them already carried every question, every answer. The next morning, as the storm calmed, Nathan prepared his sled to take her back. The journey was silent. But as the gates of Greystone came into view, the first gaze to meet theirs was Mrs. Clarice's, sharp, cold, and laced with a closed-lipped smile of verdict. The rumor spread like fire on dry parchment. Miss Merlot spent the night in a widower's cabin. When Isabel stepped into the store, her father was already there, pale, jaw clenched, eyes unreadable. No questions, no comfort, only one sentence. "We will do what needs to be done to fix this." The air inside the store was thick like ash. Isabel stood across from her father, still trembling from the cold, though the chill in his gaze cut deeper than the snow clinging to her shoulders. "Do you realize," Elias Merlot said, his voice clipped and cold, "that a single night is enough to erase your name from the ledgers of honor?" Isabel said nothing. She clutched her shawl tighter, eyes fixed on the worn tile floor. "They say you spent the night in a widower's cabin," he continued. "No one cares about truth. They only want a story worth repeating." "I didn't," "It doesn't matter," he snapped. "What matters is they already believe it." He exhaled then, dry, brittle, like someone mourning a loss they'd never retrieve. "If you still want to live in Greystone, you must marry him." Nathan Hale. Soon after, Nathan was called in. He stood in the doorway, tall, silent, unreadable. No greetings were exchanged. Elias turned to him and asked, "Are you willing to marry my daughter?" Nathan looked at Isabel. She didn't plead. She didn't deny. She offered only a steady gaze, holding back collapse. "If she agrees," Nathan said slowly, "I won't refuse." Isabel wanted to react, to shout, to cry, to say no, but everything caught in her throat. Years of living under the weight of expectations had taught her one thing: how to survive through silence. She nodded, not out of belief, but because silence had always been her armor. The wedding took place in silence. There were no flowers, no music, no congratulatory smiles. Only the toll of the church bell like a warning and the quiet stares of those watching, not as witnesses but as judges. Isabel Merlo walked into the chapel in a borrowed dress, with no bouquet, no one by her side. Nathan Hale waited at the altar in an old suit, pressed but faded, his gaze smoldering like slow-burning wood. When the priest asked, he replied simply, "Yes." And Isabel, she had to gather all the air in her chest just to whisper, "I do." The ceremony ended like a funeral without tears. No one lingered. No one walked them out. Nathan didn't take her hand. He only walked ahead, leading the way back to the cabin, as if even he wasn't sure he was ready to be a husband. In the days that followed, time passed slowly. The cabin was small, but the distance between them felt vast. Isabel rose before dawn, sweeping floors, tending the fire, washing cloths, and making soup from whatever she could find. Nathan left early each day, chopping wood, fixing the roof, checking traps. They didn't touch. They didn't argue. They didn't greet the mornings. Sometimes she sat by the window, eyes unfocused. The cabin held no trace of a woman, no dried flowers, no lace, no mirror. Only woodworking tools, technical books, and blocks of unshaped timber. At night, they shared the same table, but not the same words. Nathan placed a bowl of soup in front of her, never asking if it tasted right. She answered with a small nod. One afternoon, Isabel opened her suitcase and found a letter from Julian Davenport, the man who once promised her marriage, then disappeared. His once sweet words now read like irony. She didn't cry loudly. She just sat, trembling, holding the letter to her chest like a relic of youthful foolishness. Nathan stood outside the room. He saw her curled in on herself but did not step in. That night, without a word, he left a small wooden box beside the sewing stool. Inside, a spool of thread and a set of needles. No note. But Isabel understood. It was his way of saying she was no longer invisible here. That afternoon, the sky cleared strangely after days of gloom. Isabel felt the need for air, so she wrapped her scarf, slipped on her boots, and picked up a woven basket, planning to gather dry branches in the nearby woods. "You should wait until I return," Nathan had said that morning. But it wasn't a command, just a soft suggestion. Isabel didn't want to be a burden. She needed space and clarity. The forest was still, the snow sunk deep. She stepped carefully, collecting frost-covered twigs. The air carried the sweet sharpness of cold and decay. As she bent down to pick another stick, she heard it. A crisp snap, followed by heavy breathing. 3 gray figures emerged from behind the trees. Wolves. Silent. No growl, just approaching. Their eyes glowed like embers in the dim woods. Her basket dropped. Isabel stepped back, slipped, and fell into the steel-cold snow. Her eyes wide, her throat locked. Fear stole her voice. Then, a gunshot cracked through the forest, echoing like thunder. The wolves scattered. Another shot. Snarls receded into the distance. Isabel trembled, everything blurred. Nathan rushed in, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. "Are you hurt?" he asked, eyes still scanning the tree line. She shook her head, unable to speak. He didn't wait. He lifted her, just like he had that first night, and carried her silently back to the cabin. That evening, the fire burned bright. Isabel sat, wrapped in layers of wool, still shaking. Nathan said nothing. He placed a small linen-wrapped bundle on the table. She opened it. A hand-carved wooden figure, rough and simple, two people standing side by side, not touching hands, but their shoulders nearly met. No note, no explanation. But Isabel understood. He had seen her, and in his silence, he had begun to carve something unnamed. One night, after a heavy snowfall, the sky over Greystone turned clear as glass. Nathan opened the cabin door, stood still for a moment, then turned back inside and said quietly, "You should come outside. I want to show you something." Isabel pulled on another coat and followed him to the porch. They crossed the snow-covered clearing and stopped at a small hill. Above them, the aurora borealis spilled across the sky like living silk, glowing in hues of green and violet. The world seemed to hold its breath. "My wife once dreamed of seeing the northern lights," Nathan said, eyes fixed on the sky. "We planned a trip to Iceland, but then the fire happened. I couldn't save her. I built hundreds of homes for others, yet I failed to protect my own." His voice wasn't cracked, just low and honest. Isabel pressed her hands deeper into her coat and replied gently, "The man who promised to marry me disappeared when the rumors began. I don't resent him anymore. I just regret that I once believed my worth depended on someone else's choice." They stood in silence for a long moment, the aurora dancing on the snow and in their eyes. Nathan turned to her. "I've never asked anyone to stay here." Isabel smiled softly. "No one's ever tried to keep me." He held out his hand, not rushed. She placed hers in his. For the first time, they truly touched. Not out of duty, not out of pity, but through a shared, quiet vulnerability. The northern lights continued their silent swirl above, but between their clasped hands, another light was kindling, quieter, deeper. The snow had begun to melt, revealing streaks of brown earth beneath the white. Water dripped from the rooftop like spring's hesitant whisper. Isabel was hanging a thick quilt over the railing when she saw the familiar figure approaching along the forest path. Julian Davenport. He hadn't changed much. Still polished, still wearing leather shoes that looked out of place on a muddy trail. "Isabel," he called, as if no years had passed. "I need to talk to you." Nathan wasn't home. Isabel invited him in, not out of warmth, but for clarity. They sat across from each other, the fire crackling quietly in the hearth. Julian pulled an envelope from his coat. "I was wrong. To leave. To stay silent. But now I can make it right." He placed the letter on the table. "This isn't your world, Isabel. You deserve silk sheets, not bark and snow. Come back to where you belong." Isabel didn't answer right away. Once, those words would have been everything she longed for. But now, in this wooden cabin, near a fire Nathan had lit and a chair carved by his hands, she wasn't sure what herself meant anymore. "You came too late," she said softly. Julian lowered his head, fists tightening. "It's still possible, if you want it." When he left, leaving the letter and a hopeful glance behind, Isabel stood at the doorway for a long time. On the table, Nathan's wooden carving still sat, unpolished, silent. It promised no ease, only presence, real and unspoken. Isabel picked up the letter. She didn't tear it, didn't open it. She placed it beside the carving. Between the polished past and the raw present, she hadn't decided yet. But her heart had already begun to lean. After the meeting with Julian, Isabel said nothing more. But she did not leave. Not out of duty, but because something inside her still lingered. like roots quietly clinging to soil, even before the bloom. The next morning, when Nathan returned from the village market, he saw Isabel bent behind the cabin, sowing seeds. The earth was still cold, her hands trembling, but her movements were gentle and deliberate. He didn't need to ask. He knew. She had chosen to stay. Nathan said nothing, simply set the basket on the step, then began building a wooden frame at the side of the cabin. He planned to add a small extension, to let in more light, he said. From that day, they began to share space in quiet ways. Isabel aired the blankets, Nathan split the wood. Isabel made soup, Nathan peeled vegetables. They didn't touch, didn't speak much, but each act whispered gently, "I see you here." One afternoon, while Isabel sat sewing by the window, Nathan approached, placing a worn cloth on the table. An old coat, torn at the shoulder. She smiled. For the first time, the smile lingered. "I'll mend it." "It doesn't have to be perfect," he said. "Just strong." Isabel looked up. In their eyes, the unspoken began to take shape. They were both wounded, both left behind. But in this wooden cabin, they were learning to trust again, little by little. That night, Nathan placed a new wooden carving on the table. She looked. It showed a woman planting seeds beside a man holding out his arms like shelter. No name, no words, but this time, Isabel brushed her hand against Nathan's shoulder as she passed, and he tilted his head slightly, in quiet reply. Here, where the wind still bit and snow still clung to the roof, spring had begun in the smallest of things. News of her father's death arrived on a morning when the snow had half melted, the ground beginning to breathe, and shy green shoots peeked through the fence behind the cabin. The messenger didn't climb the hill, only left the letter in the old wooden box hanging by the door. Isabel opened the envelope, her hand trembling slightly as she recognized the familiar handwriting. A farewell letter from her father. Brief, but heavier than anything he had ever said. "Live as you wish, not as they expect." She read it again and again under the pale sunlight, as if it were not just his last words, but the key to a door she had never dared to open. The moment Isabel finished reading her father's letter, she folded it, slipped it into her coat, and turned to Nathan. "I have to go. Now." On the way down the mountain, the snow had nearly melted, but the ground was slick and the wind cut sharp. Nathan walked on the outside, shielding her from the wind, his hand steady at her elbow whenever the path sloped. "You don't have to be strong all the time," he said, the first words he spoke during the journey. "If you're tired today, lean on me." Isabel turned away, not wanting him to see the tears already welling in her eyes. When they reached the village, all eyes turned toward them. Whispers rose. But this time, Isabel didn't lower her head. She walked beside Nathan, his shoulder nearly brushing hers, a quiet shield. In the old house where her father now rested, Nathan didn't leave her side. He adjusted pillows, made tea for visiting relatives, fixed the crooked picture frame on the wall. That night, when the guests had gone, Isabel sat in silence before the altar. Nathan set down a cup of hot tea and murmured, "People'd be proud." Isabel nodded. In that worn old home, for the first time, she didn't feel alone. Years had passed since the day Isabel returned to the village to bury her father. That winter marked the end of something old, and quietly, it began a spring that never truly left. Now, the wooden cabin echoed with the laughter of children. The garden behind bloomed lush and green, and everywhere on the porch stood wooden carvings. Nathan's handiwork, each one holding a memory, a quiet piece of their journey. Isabel was no longer the girl whispered about. She was the woman others turned to for wisdom, the one young mothers visited for comfort. And beside her stood a man no longer broken by loss, but respected for the steadiness in his hands and the warmth he built into their home. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Every day they lived as though they had chosen each other, not by force, but because it was where they could breathe, believe, and rest. That evening, as the sunset spilled gold behind the pines, Isabel rested her head on Nathan's shoulder. She murmured, voice touched with a smile, "Who knew the storm would lead us here?" Nathan gently pulled her closer. "Not fate, you." And as the wind swept gently around their home in the woods, the truth lingered in the quiet. Love didn't arrive like a thunder. It grew like a seed beneath the snow.